Welcome. My name is Patty Laughlin, and I'm with Sarah Janda, and we are excited to be part of the public programming sponsored by the Cherokee Strip Regional Heritage Center and Jake Crumwitty, as well as Elizabeth Bass and Kathy Dixon at the Oklahoma Historical Society and Oklahoma Humanities. We've been working on a project for a long time now.
Couple of years, yes.
Called This Land is Herland, Gendered Activism in Oklahoma from the 1870s to the 2010s.
Yes.
And maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So this is a project that has been in the making because there hasn't been enough attention to women's activism in Oklahoma. And so we took this opportunity to work with our friends and colleagues who also study the history of women in Oklahoma. And we've put together 13 biographical chapters that really look at how women have engaged in activism in Oklahoma. And as we talk about the three sections, it's probably helpful to define what we mean by activism. It's women who have tried to affect change in the circumstances and society in which they found themselves. And so our people that we are talking about in the three panels that you will see range. They range in political beliefs, they range in perceptions of suffrage, they range in ethnicity and race, and all kinds of ways. But we're really interested in talking about how women have chosen to become active and try and shape change around them. And so I think that's one of the things that we often want to emphasize.
So during this year, as we highlight the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage, we're excited to participate in Oklahoma Women 100 or OK Women 100. And we have a sneak peek through these three panels to take a look at the women's activism that will be featured in the book.
So in our second panel discussion, what we see is a focus on the gendered nature of segregation and civil rights. So of course, segregation in Oklahoma had a profound effect on all people, not just women and not just African American women. But because of the way that the Oklahoma Constitution is written, women who were African American and men who were African American were designated black, and everyone else, including Native Americans, fell into a category of other or white. And so what we see in this second panel is a look at how segregated society in Oklahoma comes to be challenged and how specifically it shapes women in Oklahoma. And so the first piece that we have in the panel discussion by Cheryl Wattley is a look at Ada Lois Sipuel Fisher, who is an extraordinarily important Oklahoman for her effort and the courage that she showed in challenging segregation in higher education, specifically in graduate programs. And through her efforts, she became the first African American to attend the University of Oklahoma School of Law. And she did so while being threatened. She did so while undergoing tremendous personal stress. And so we look at how this young woman who was married to a veteran, who was an outstanding student, who goes through a tremendous amount to try and help participate in the integration process. So we see her story. The second piece in the panel discussion is about a woman named Rosie Gilchrist, and this gives us an opportunity to look at another side of civil rights and gender, which is a white woman who was forced into an insane asylum for a period of 5 years because she tried to sell her house to a black man. And so women are not safe in many ways in terms of being able to support civil rights in a way that doesn't ultimately undercut them, in a period when many Oklahomans opposed any kind of effort at racial integration. And then the third piece that we see in the panel is by Lindsay Churchill, and she's talking about the LGBTQ activism and work that we see in Barbara Waru, Cleveland. And Cleveland is a very interesting Oklahoman because she grew up knowing that her sexuality and her race made her other. It made her different, and she worked really hard to overcome some of those obstacles and create Herland Sister Resources and bookstore and create a safe place for women. And we think that's such an important thing to bring out. So even in just the women in panel 2, you see a lot of variation in activism and effort and consequence. And that's something we're really trying to highlight as we think about women's right to vote. That it's not just about the ballot box. There's so many contributions that women have made, and so much that they've really had to overcome, I think, to get to that point.
Absolutely.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jake Crumwitty, and I am the director at the Cherokee Strip Regional Heritage Center in Enid, Oklahoma, and I want to thank you for joining us in this difficult time. Taking part in anything right now can be difficult at best. So thank you for taking part in this important presentation as we explore together the history of women's activism in Oklahoma from 1870 to 2010. I want to thank the Oklahoma Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, whose financial support makes this program possible. Also, I am grateful for the collaboration of partners at the Museum of the Western Prairie, the Cherokee Strip Regional Heritage Center, the Oklahoma History Center, and the Oklahoma Historical Society as a whole. I'm very excited and pleased to present this series of panel discussions to you. This program is part of a larger project. This Land is Her Land, Gendered Activism in Oklahoma, 1870s to 2010, which is a volume of works edited by Sarah Eppler Janda and Patricia Laughlin, with the anticipated publication in the fall of 2021 from the University of Oklahoma Press. Now, the views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy of the Oklahoma Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, or the Oklahoma Historical Society. This second program of our series is on the topic of gendered politics of civil rights, with the research of Cheryl Wattley, Sarah Eppler Janda, and Lindsay Churchill. Cheryl Wattley is a professor of law and director of experimental learning at the University of North Texas Dallas College of Law. Wattley's book, A Step Toward Brown v. the Board of Education, Ada Lois Sipuel Fisher, and Her Fight to End Segregation, received the Oklahoma Book Award on Nonfiction. Sarah Eppler Janda is the professor of history at Cameron University in Lawton, Oklahoma. She received her PhD in history in 2002 from the University of Oklahoma, where she focused on the 20th century Oklahoma and Native American women's history. She is the author of Beloved Women, The Political Lives of LaDonna Harris and Wilma Mankiller, Pride of the Wichitas, The History of Cameron University, and Prairie Power, Student Activism, Counterculture, and Backlash in Oklahoma, 1962 to 1972. She's an active member of the Coalition for Women's History, the Western History Association, and the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. She is currently co-editing This Land is Her Land, Gendered Activism in Oklahoma, 1870s to 2010, with Patty Laughlin. Lindsay Churchill is an associate professor of history at the University of Central Oklahoma. She is the creator and director of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. In 2015, she worked with the campus community to create the center, which includes the Women's Research Center and the BGLTQ Plus Student Center. She is the author of Becoming the Tupamaros, the Solidarity and Transnational Revolutionaries in Uruguay and the United States. Churchill worked with the Fulbright Scholar Specialist in Latvia in 2016, and she is the recipient of Oklahoma Human Rights Award from the United Nations Associations and the Oklahoma University Human Rights Association in 2016. Once again, thank you so much for joining us for This Land is Her Land as we explore gendered activism in Oklahoma.
It was a young, determined woman who decided that she would be the point person in the fight to bring down Oklahoma's school segregation laws. In 1946, when Ada Lois Sipuel Fisher applied for admission to the University of Oklahoma Law School, she was publicly and openly holding herself out as the face of this legal battle. We don't know how Ada Lois viewed the fact that she was a woman in taking on this historic role. But we do know that for Thurgood Marshall, the fact that she was a woman was a part of his calculation that she would be a good plaintiff. Marshall believed that Ada Lois, a demure, attractive young woman, would be less threatening, that she wouldn't summon up the deep-seated fears of over-sexualized Black men. It would be easier for her to ultimately integrate into the schoolroom setting when the legal battle was won. We also know that Ada Lois was the daughter of a very strong and fiercely proud Black woman. Her mother, Maybelle Sipuel, was an entrepreneur. She ran a neighborhood grocery store rather than working as a maid. She was politically involved. When the local sheriff, who had abandoned the jail, allowing an angry mob to lynch Henry Argo, was up for re-election, she made a sign and put it in the back of her car and drove up and down the streets of Chickasha, reminding people that he had allowed Henry Argo to be lynched. She was active in Chickasha politics, attending city council meetings and making speeches, and she was ultimately appointed to the board that oversaw the Negro Park. And Ada Lois's mother was very active with the Oklahoma NAACP. She took Ada Lois with her to the state convention, where the featured speaker was Thurgood Marshall. That was a memory that would stay with Ada Lois throughout her life. And she was a woman of faith. Her father was a bishop with the AME Church, and she was raised in the church, growing and maturing in her religious beliefs. So when in 1945, the Oklahoma NAACP went searching for a plaintiff, one ready to sue for admission to OU, Ada Lois was ready. She was an honors graduate of the Black High School in Chickasha, Lincoln High School, an honors graduate of Langston University, the university in Oklahoma for its Black citizens, and she had even been involved in protests, being a part of a delegation going to the state officials to lobby for more funds for Langston's campus. Ada Lois was ready, but the NAACP didn't go looking for her. They approached her brother Lemuel, who said no. He had recently returned from World War II and he was ready to go on to his life. But when he said no, she said yes. She volunteered. And when she volunteered and said she would step forward, she knew about Oklahoma's violent history. She knew about the Tulsa race war that had destroyed the Greenwood section because her parents had lived in Greenwood. Their home was burned. Her father had been escorted at gunpoint to the area where they were corralling the Black men. She knew about the lynching of Henry Argo in her hometown, the night her father stood guard with the rifle in the front door, keeping his family safe. And obviously she knew about Oklahoma's strict segregation laws. She had ridden in the back of the bus. She had climbed the stairs to the balcony for the segregated theater. She had known that she couldn't go swimming in the city pool. And she had attended the school for Black children in Chickasha. She had gone to the university for Black citizens. And she also knew about Lloyd Gaines. Lloyd Gaines had been the last NAACP plaintiff. And while he had won before the US Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court had ordered the state of Missouri to provide him with a legal education, Lloyd Gaines mysteriously disappeared. Many people believe that he had been lynched and his body disposed of in a way that it could never, ever be found. So even knowing all of these things, realizing that she could become the target of this racial hatred, she said, "I'll do it." And she stepped forward. What role did her gender play in that decision? What we do know is that the day she walked on OU's campus, she did so with poise and dignity, knowing that she would be stared at, knowing that there might be many people who would oppose her entry. And she stood in line, waiting her turn, only to be greeted with the question, "Why are you here?" And a clear, simple response, "I'm here to apply to law school." And that is what she did. She told Dr. Cross, the president of the university, with a firmness and determination that she was qualified to be a student and that she could do the work. And Dr. Cross agreed, but he said that the law required that he deny her admission. Oklahoma's laws required segregation in education, and it made it a crime for anyone to put Black and white students in the same classroom. But at her request and the request of Roscoe Dungy, the head of the Oklahoma NAACP, Dr. Cross wrote a letter recognizing that Ada Lois was qualified in every respect for admission to OU Law School, except that she was African American and Oklahoma law required segregation. That letter launched a legal battle that would take 3.5 years. There would be repeated court hearings, and every time Ada Lois would attend, she would always be hoping that maybe this was going to be the time that Oklahoma would do the right thing and allow her to attend OU. And every time she walked away disappointed, but still determined. Until the day in January 1948, she walked up the steps to the United States Supreme Court. On that day, she was so excited, saying the words, "Equal justice, equal justice." Maybe this would be the day that she would receive justice, and it was. For within a few days, the U.S. Supreme Court issued an order that Oklahoma provide Ada Lois with a legal education at the same time that it provided one to white students. Not when you got a law school built for her, not when in the future you thought you had money, not any time when you decide it's okay. Right at the same time you offer that legal education to white students, you must offer it to Black students. And this was important because the winter semester was going to start in just a few weeks, and the Oklahoma attorneys had told the justices that there's no way we can build a separate law school for Ada Lois in that time period. We don't have the money, we can't possibly do it. And so the Supreme Court ruling meant that Ada Lois had to be admitted to OU. But Oklahoma was not going to let its segregation laws be destroyed. And instead, a law school was created just for Ada Lois in 7 days, just in time before the beginning of the winter semester. They rented space in the Capitol building, they hired part-time faculty, and then they posted a cardboard sign proclaiming that Langston Law School was now open. And not only was it now open, it was equal to OU Law School. And they would argue later, perhaps in some way superior, because the faculty-student ratio would help Ada Lois because she'd be the only student. But Ada Lois wasn't taken in by that trick. She wasn't fooled by that sham. She returned to OU and applied again for admission to the law school. And again, she was denied. It would take another 18 months before Ada Lois would be admitted to OU, 18 months before Oklahoma realized that it was a waste of money to keep Langston Law School open when it had no students. But until it closed, Ada Lois could not be admitted to the University of Oklahoma. But in the meantime, because of the Supreme Court order in her case, the University of Delaware and the University of Arkansas admitted its first Black graduate students. And 6 more African American students applied to OU for graduate study, ultimately forcing the admission of George McLaurin as the first Black person to attend OU. His admission required by the Supreme Court ruling in Ada Lois's case. But perhaps most importantly, for the first time in Oklahoma history, white and Black citizens joined together in support of an issue. The issue was the admission of Ada Lois to OU Law School. Students at the all-white Phillips University in Enid, Oklahoma, protested in support and established a branch of the NAACP on its campus. Over 1,000 OU students gathered in a rally burning a piece of paper symbolizing the destruction of the 14th Amendment by the Oklahoma court rulings. Student polls were taken on OU's campus, and it was determined that a majority of the students supported her admission. And finally, on that day in June of 1949, when Ada Lois was finally able to walk up the steps of Monette Hall to her law school classes, she entered with relatively little controversy. There was no angry mob, no people jeering at her. She took with her her sense of self and her fighting spirit, because though she'd won the battle to attend the law school, her victory was going to be attending classes with white men and 2 white women, to be in what had to be the strangest of environments for her, because she'd never gone to school with white people before. So her reward for her determination was to be in this really foreign environment, and then she had to walk past her classmates, up the steps to the back of the classroom, to a chair specially designated for her, set aside and labeled colored. But she was able to take that humiliation and transform it into a victory, because she had faith. Faith that one day even this separate seat would be gone. One day even this separation would disappear, and she would be allowed to take her rightful place in the classroom with her classmates. So when we look at college campuses across this nation today, when we think about the landmark opinion of Brown versus Board of Education, we need to remember, as she called herself, that skinny little girl from Chickasha, Oklahoma, who grew up into a woman of courage, determination, dignity, and faith. A woman who took her talents and skills and contributed to the elimination of legal segregation in this nation.
I am excited today to get to talk to you a little bit about a woman that is not well known in history, a woman by the name of Rosalyn Coleman Gilchrist, more commonly known to her friends and family as Rosie. And as we think a little bit about this issue of the gendered nature of civil rights, as we saw with Cheryl Wattley's piece on Ada Lois Sipuel Fisher, as we look at the effort by people to achieve full equality in the United States, there's no separating that from the experience of being female for female activists. And just as Cheryl talked about the issues that Ada Lois faced, so too do we see other women within the civil rights movement facing a range of challenges. Now, the woman I'm going to talk about is not perhaps who you would expect to discuss in the context of civil rights activism, because I'm going to be talking about a middle-class white woman who was a homemaker, who has escaped the memory of history in many respects. If it hadn't been for her son, Coleman, writing about his mother's experiences and his own anti-war activism, Rosie's story would be lost to us. And if it hadn't been for his willingness to share his mother's story with me, her medical records, some of the intimate details of the family experiences, I wouldn't be able to talk about what happened to Rosie. And so I want to take a little bit to look at this other side of the gendered politics of civil rights, which is what happened to a white woman who became awakened to the need to effect change in Oklahoma. This is a woman who was in many ways emotionally and physically fragile. She was in a very unhappy marriage. In 1959, she likely attempted suicide by setting herself on fire in the bathroom as her family got ready to attend church services. It was not officially ruled a suicide, though her family always believed that that is in fact what had happened when she had a gallon of gasoline that she used to set herself on fire in the bathroom on a very devastating Sunday morning for her family. She was rushed to the hospital, not expected to survive because she had burns over 80% of her body. A young physician was given the opportunity to experiment using some new treatments he had pioneered because they didn't think she would live. And over the next 2.5 years, Rosie underwent numerous surgeries and sustained a tremendous amount of pain. At many points, she was not expected to live. Well, because of the way that segregation functioned in Oklahoma at so many levels beyond separate facilities for blacks and whites, the way that segregation and racism worked in hospitals in Oklahoma is that African American nurses were given the jobs that no white nurses wanted to do. And that is how Rosie Gilchrist became introduced to the civil rights movement. She is a woman who was shunned by many in her white community. The only nurses who worked on her in the years that she was in and out of Baptist Hospital were African American nurses. And their care of Rosie didn't just stop with the treatment that they provided her in the hospital. They took their concerns about her to their churches, and they prayed for her before all of her surgeries, the 24 surgeries that she had in the next few years. Their churches, their families were intimately acquainted with the story of Rosie Gilchrist. And so she began to learn about the civil rights activism that was going on in Oklahoma. And when she was released from the hospital and began trying to reacclimate herself to her life in an all-white neighborhood in War Acres, she found that many of her former friends wouldn't make eye contact with her. They didn't want to socialize with her. When she tried to go back to her home church where her boys were actively engaged in the choir, the minister called and asked that she not go back because the way she looked was frightening to the children and other members of the church. And so she was shunned. But she was welcome in black churches in Oklahoma City, because they'd been praying for her for years by this time. And so her sense of abandonment was coupled with her desire to effect change for African Americans. And she got involved working with Clara Looper, and she got involved going to demonstrations at the Wedgwood Amusement Park and trying to integrate cafeterias like Maud's Cafeteria. And she increasingly devoted herself to this effort, even inviting African American young people who were a member of the NAACP Youth Council into her home. And at great sacrifice to herself and her family financially, after securing a divorce from her husband in the spring of 1963, she embarked upon a journey to Washington, D.C. in August of 1963. She was the only white female chaperone that was included on the trip to the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, when he talked about the intolerance of racism and demanded change and the need for freedom. As she listened to the words of Martin Luther King Jr., as she dedicated herself to the sacrifice necessary to effecting change, she met a young doctor on the trip, James West, who was a young African American, had a young family looking to buy a house close to the hospital where he worked. And Rosie's financial issues that had grown worse as her husband wasn't paying the custody support that he was supposed to be paying since their divorce a few months earlier, she decided this was a perfect solution. He was looking for a house and that was near where she lived. She had a house to sell. And so she agreed to sell this young doctor her house. Little did she know that this single decision would result in her being placed in an insane asylum for 5 long years. Because what happened is that the people in War Acres, already suspicious of her efforts to bring African Americans into their community, at least that's how they viewed her opening her home to Youth Council NAACP meetings, they quickly acted to try and stop her from selling her house. They began reaching out to her sons, trying to get them to notify them if there was anything off in her behavior. Her sons, Coleman and Jim, who at this point were 15, didn't really want to move. They lived in this house for several years. It's where their friends were. And so they began to give way to the pressure that they were receiving from the sheriff, from their minister, from their father, to just say that there was something a little off in her behavior. And finally, Coleman gave in to this and went to the sheriff and said, yes, my mom is behaving a little strangely. They used that as a pretext to go to her house and arrest her, take her into custody, hold a trial in the back room, not even in an official courtroom, and sentence her to confinement. And the next day, after spending the night in the city jail, the next day she was transported to Griffin Memorial Hospital in Norman, where she spent most of the next 5 years of her life. And what's astounding, I think, about Rosie's case is that her medical records reveal she was confined because she tried to sell her house to a black man, that was equated with a kind of insanity. She was there for confinement as opposed to treatment. A woman who likely had attempted to commit suicide, who probably could have used counseling, who was in a great deal of physical pain as a result of her burns that continued to cover her body and the scar tissue that caused her a tremendous amount of pain on a regular basis. So this was a woman who found herself losing everything: her home, her furniture, custody of her sons that the court had just awarded her a few months earlier when she had divorced her husband. She stayed in that facility for 5 years until her son Coleman, who was involved in protesting against the draft in the Vietnam War, had come back to Oklahoma from college because he had had the audacity to mail his draft card back to the Oklahoma City Draft Board, deciding he could not in good conscience carry it any longer. He was giving a talk on the anti-war movement, and E. Melvin Porter, a well-renowned civil rights activist and attorney and state senator in Oklahoma by 1968, heard him talk, recognized his last name, and asked him if he was any relation to Rosie Gilchrist and what had happened, because she seemed to stop coming to civil rights meetings. And when Coleman told E. Melvin Porter what had happened, Porter said, well, let me look into it. Let's see if we can get her out. After looking into it, Porter could find no record of her trial, her hearing, anything about her confinement, except that he was able to confirm that she was being held at Griffin Memorial Hospital. And so they made an appointment and they went. Coleman, E. Melvin Porter, and one of Coleman's friends who happened to be working as a journalist that summer, Paul Ray. And they went and they demanded that she be released. And if she wasn't released, they threatened a story being published the next day. And within half an hour, Rosie had been released. And what I think this story tells us in many ways is the precarious intersection, or the precarious relationship between being female and supporting equality. On the one hand, it's a mark of how far the country and the state of Oklahoma had come that a black man had enough power, finally, to secure the release of a white woman being confined for no legal reason whatsoever. On the other, this white woman in 1968 is finally released, not because of anything she was able to do for herself, but because of a happenstance meeting that her son had with Porter. And as we think about the double challenge often that women face in the effort to secure equality, and as we see with Lindsay Churchill's work, there is an abundance of challenge in the face of Oklahoma women and women in general who have spoken up for equality, who have demanded civil rights. No one seemed to remember Rosie Gilchrist in the civil rights movement. Many of the young people active in the Youth NAACP Council had forgotten her, didn't remember her name. And yet, she made a tremendous sacrifice to try and effect equality for all Oklahomans. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to the Oklahoma History Center for having me here today, and thank you all for watching. I'm so excited to be part of this wonderful edited collection, and thank you to co-editors Sarah, Eppler, Janda, and Dr. Patty Laughlin for this forthcoming book that I'm going to be a part of that I'm really excited about. And the name has a special meaning to me, as you'll hear very soon, and it's entitled This Land is Herland, Gendered Activism in Oklahoma, 1870s to 2010s. So how did I get started on my project? Well, beginning in about 2016, I worked with an Oklahoma City-based organization, Herland Sister Resources, which is a lesbian feminist activist group that's been around since the 1980s. And we did a couple things. We got a grant to preserve their stories, their oral histories, and also to preserve an amazing amount of books, records, pamphlets, over 5,000 items actually, which was the largest book donation in UCO history, which we're really proud of. So this donation contained rare fiction and nonfiction books, and basically had a very large collection of lesbian fiction, just things that you can't really find in Oklahoma, and in some cases you can't find in most of the world. So in getting this donation, we were able to secure an actual physical space for our Women's Research Center and BGLTQ+ Student Center. So the center opened its physical location in 2017 on UCO's campus, and it offers support for LGBTQ+ students and for female identifying students on campus. So the donation of these books happened in large part because members of Herland wanted these materials to be cataloged, memorialized, and appreciated, and also preserved by a younger generation. So let me talk a little bit about Herland. As I said, the Oklahoma City-based organization, Herland Sister Resources, currently describes themselves as a womanist organization with a strong lesbian focus. However, the group stresses on Facebook that Herland is not just restricted to lesbians and that all women are welcome. So Herland was officially founded in 1983 by Barbara Waru Cleveland, and Barbara Waru Cleveland is the focus of my book chapter. I was able to talk with her several times throughout the last 4 years and interview her about the creation of Herland, which was just an amazing thing, especially in the context of the time, Oklahoma, early 1980s. And what Cleveland did at first was she worked with her friends to create a bookstore, which would later become a lending library, a meeting space, and in 1987, they would purchase a home as well. So the space Herland provided offered this solace from the unsupportive and at times dangerous cultural and political environment within Oklahoma in the 1980s. To be a lesbian in Oklahoma in the 1980s meant that you had to be afraid to lose your family, your job, and maybe even your life. And we hear that story repeated by several different members of Herland when talking about their experiences. So Barbara Cleveland knew a great deal about feeling marginalized for being different. She was born on April 2nd, 1945 in Oklahoma City, and as an African-American woman born during segregation, she remembers the feeling and impact of discrimination on her family. And she's a person who participated in the civil rights movement in Oklahoma City, and then at the age of 17, decided to enroll in Central State University, which later became University of Central Oklahoma, which was where all the books would be donated to, so it kind of comes full circle in that way. She said she wanted to attend Central State, in large part because she wanted to continue her activism and fight for integration within Oklahoma City. So she actually recalled that instructors worked actively to flunk out the 4 African American students that were involved in the science program at the time. During her college years, Cleveland also remembered police harassment on several different occasions, and a police officer pointing a gun on her at the University of Oklahoma's Health Sciences Center. She also conveyed to me some positive memories as well, such as her classmates making sure she had food while she struggled to get through college. So despite all these hardships, Cleveland eventually graduated with a BS in chemistry, biology, and medical technology. Her life would take a very different path, however, as she focused more on music and activism. So the summer of 1982, Cleveland connected with a group of women who were producing some really awesome feminist and lesbian publications. One of them was named the Brazen Hussy Rag, I love that name. Another was Sister Advocate. And these were groups named like La Salle de Femme and Let's Talk Women. And she worked with them to create this bookstore. And Cleveland was the one who talked to the owner of the storefront. This is a very old, like I believe she said this one was in her 80s, and convinced this woman to sell Cleveland this storefront. So Cleveland remembers being inspired by a bookstore that she saw in Nashville, and she wanted to include women of all sexualities, and she hoped to connect activists from all over for the National Organization for Women, the National Women's Political Caucus, and the Women of Herland. So Cleveland recalled, some of the women wanted mostly a lesbian bookstore. My feeling was that, and it still is my feeling, that we need to be more inclusive and not exclusive in our movements. Because one of my phrases is that every movement out there has merit, needs our help, and we need their help. And so Herland also self-published a book 20 years after their creation and talked about Cleveland. She talked about how they talked about how Cleveland brought together all these different women's organizations and tried to get them under this umbrella and have this physical place where they could have a bookstore. And they had a really expansive feminist library, and many of these journals, these publications were not accessible to people in Oklahoma. And it showed to the strength of Cleveland and the others who were organizing to create this storefront, this bookstore as it originally started as, especially since Oklahoma was so anti-woman and anti-LGBTQ+ during the 1980s, and some would argue, of course, that it still is. So the political climate of Oklahoma is largely repressive, but the Herland Sister Resources bookstore offered this alternative. It offered this inclusive narrative of gender and sexuality. It also offered a space to politically organize and create this new vision for solidarity. And another thing I love is the group also included books that were banned, or considered pornographic at the time, such as The Joy of Lesbian Sex, Torch Song Trilogy. And another thing I think is really important to mention is that Herland was a group founded by an African American woman, but its membership primarily consisted of white women of various social classes. Cleveland and others who started Herland in the 1980s dealt with the political climate in Oklahoma that also included the rights and the fight for the ERA. They were doing this all alongside the rise of the moral majority and hundreds of millions of dollars ended up being campaign against the so-called gay peril. So in their interviews, we see time and time again Herland sisters expressing worry over being fired for a job because of their sexuality. Some of the Herland sisters actually worked as public school teachers, and they had to be extremely careful to hide their private life and their sexuality. This was in part due to an Oklahoma statute that allowed for schools to fire teachers who participated in public homosexual activity or conduct. It was not until 1985 when a court of appeals reversed that ruling, but they also said it was okay to prohibit public homosexual activity. So this kind of shows one of the many ways that Oklahoma law paved the way for this legal discrimination against LGBTQ plus individuals. And it's something that Herland also fought against with legal defense funds, fundraisers, boots on the ground activism. So we have this very repressive environment for feminists, for queer people in Oklahoma. And Herland sisters, they wanted to not only fight the oppressive laws and things that seemed at times to be just completely overwhelming these odds, by hosting events, by creating spaces that had never really existed before outside the bar scene. So some examples of these events, which I think are great, include a Women in Madness conference, a gay film festival at the University of Oklahoma that they helped to co-sponsor, as well as a conference with HBCU Langston University entitled Sisters, Voices of a Different Color. Collaborations such as these were very important, since Herland was never particularly racially diverse regarding membership. Herland also took an active role in domestic violence activism, sexual assault activism, and they remained committed to this despite the fact that in the 1980s, lesbians were actually purged from the domestic violence movement, and some of our members talk about that experience as well. So the group not only demonstrated this kind of solidarity through political actions, but also through the creation of women-only spaces. And that was something that came up in talking to Cleveland, that comes up over and over again. And this model meant that they were women only, meaning that no grown men could attend these retreats. And so this exclusion of adult men from these retreats, which would happen at parks throughout Oklahoma, it made some people uncomfortable or seem counterintuitive to the movement. But we also had a lot of members tell us this was the first time I could feel really safe in a particular space. And this is a place that I could personally grow. I thought one member commented in a really powerful way. She talked about the pain that a lot of members in Herland had experienced because of patriarchy. So the retreats, they offered this alternative, this opportunity to escape this pain and to relax and to just really be yourself. So part of moving away from these so-called masculinized spaces or modes was also attempting the consensus model. And Cleveland had a very strong opinion, has a very strong opinion about the consensus model, which basically the consensus model is you have to come to an agreement all together instead of the more common ideas of voting or having one clear leader to make decisions. And Herland is still so committed to that they have a rotating board. They don't have a president or a vice president. They have Sister 1, Sister 2, Sister 3, and you just rotate these positions as to not encourage hierarchy. So as I said, Cleveland was not particularly interested or supportive of the consensus model just because of the amount of time also it would take, because sometimes these discussions would last hours and hours. So in September of 1987, something really exciting happened. Herland purchased the house that they still use for their organization. In 1988, we had the first Oklahoma City Pride Parade, but it was also the year that Cleveland left Oklahoma to pursue her graduate degree in Ohio. She would return periodically to work with Herland and attend the retreats, but when she did that, she went by the name Waru instead of Barbara. And Cleveland would lead drumming workshops at these retreats. And during this time, the group continued their important work. They worked in the Herland Legal Defense Fund, and they were actually recognized by the ACLU for this work. They hosted groups such as the Oklahoma City Two-Spirit Group for lesbian Native Americans and workshop on adoption for non-traditional families. So they kept going with this great combination of offering this physical space for safety, political activism, and something we didn't get to talk about today because of time, music, but it's in the chapter. So read that, please. And then also with literature, novels, nonfiction, monographs. So there were so many aspects of life where they were able to offer support to the LGBTQ plus community. So years later, I did a follow-up interview with Cleveland and asked her what her greatest joy was in creating Herland. And she responded, "The joy comes from finding out that I could actually do it. I miss the activism in Oklahoma. I was in NOW in the Women's Political Caucus. I miss how a handful of women would decide to do something and then go for it. True, this is not a real regret, but it's how I feel. I get lonely for Oklahoma." So from their creation as a bookstore and then their move to a house, Herland has consistently created a space for women to be activists and feminists. Through retreats, music, fellowship, the group provided a supportive space for lesbians to be open about their sexuality and connect with others. Through Cleveland's leadership and collaboration, her dream of creating a place that represented acceptance for radical women and lesbians in Oklahoma became a reality. In a climate that was not always accepting, Herland provided a revolutionary alternative to the conservative and at many times stifling climate of Oklahoma. Thank you.
We're all gonna go live with our panelists and do some question and answer with our panelists to get going with the previous stuff. So if you all have questions for Cheryl Wattley and Sarah Janda, please go ahead and send those in on the Q&A. I have one up here, but I'm sure there's others that people have. There is one question that somebody's had, will this be recorded? We do have these recorded. We will be putting them on YouTube where you will be able to hear them without any problems. I apologize for all the technical difficulties tonight. I'm not quite sure what the problem is. We did not have as many issues the first time we did this, so I don't know what the change is. But yes, we will have these all available on YouTube for you to watch and get the full, get all the information. So please go ahead and send in your questions on the Q&A, and we'll have some questions for Sarah Janda and Cheryl Wattley. And we'll go with the first question that we have was just a question about the lynching that you mentioned, Cheryl, in Chickasha. Could you talk a little bit more about that and the people involved in that?
Yeah, the lynching of Henry Argo was in 1930, and he's the last known victim of lynching in Oklahoma. He was the son of the Iceman, so he's fairly well known. He's believed to have been kind of perhaps slightly retarded. He was a little slower, and classic case, he was accused of touching, molesting a white woman, and he was taken to the jail. The sheriff did not seek assistance and was not able to protect him, and he was lynched. What was interesting about it, though, was that it followed the Tulsa race riot and the destruction of the Greenwood section of Tulsa. And when this happened in Chickasha, the black men got their rifles, assembled the families, gathered them together, and actively sought to protect the black section of Chickasha. And that's what Ada Lois really remembered, was she remembered the lynching because she knew Henry Argo as a child, but it was the activity of protection and people trying to make sure that everyone stayed safe. She was about 5-6 years old when this happened, but it is a memory that she carried with her.
Dr. Churchill, I know we had to kind of stop your presentation a little bit. Could you kind of give us a summary of what you were talking about from where we had to end? I know it was a bit of a mess there, and I apologize for that.
Yeah, so just basically very quickly, I just talked about the creation of space and how important it was for Herland and all these different ways to create various spaces for women, particularly lesbians in Oklahoma in the 1980s. So I don't know, because it was kind of what they heard, but there were different ways that they occupied space. So like with political organizing, with even having therapy that was feminist therapy and not anti-LGBTQ plus therapy within counseling. They created this library with a lot of books that were banned in Oklahoma at the time. People would come from Arkansas, Texas, Nebraska to even access these books. They also had these really cool retreats which were kind of controversial to some women. They didn't allow adult men there. And one of the big themes we see over and over again are women of Herland talking about the pain they experienced because of men, and how this was a space where they could go out in nature, read books, play music together, and have this woman-only space. And then also the consensus model, finally. I don't think we got to that, which was basically where there was no voting or one authoritarian person and nobody was in charge. So you'd have a rotation of sister one, sister two, and that helped. So there wouldn't be one central leader. So they'd have to come through everything with consensus, which Waru didn't like that model as much because he said it would just go on forever and ever. But it was a way to try to get away from these patriarchal modes of being.
All right. Thank you very much, Lindsay, for completing that for us. We have a few questions from our participants here in the webinar. For Sarah, was the son that turned Rosie into the sheriff the same one who later provided the information about her life, the same one that you got the information from?
Yes, that is correct. So his name was Joe Gilchrist growing up, and he later changed his name to Coleman, which was his mother's maiden name. And so he lived with the guilt of having gone to the sheriff and turned his mother in, though he didn't understand everything that was going on. And that's why I think it was particularly gratifying to Coleman to be able to help secure his mother's release.
And then kind of a follow-up to that, was Rosie able to continue her activism after she was released from the asylum?
So she did not really. She supported her son's effort in his draft resistance, was very supportive of that. She ended up moving to New York and working with the Catholic Worker for a while before her death in 1971. She fell from a roof, and Coleman was pretty convinced that it was suicide, successful suicide this time. She had a tremendous amount of pain, and like she couldn't close her eyes all the way. The burns were so bad, and over time the pain got worse because of the stiffening of the scar tissue. And so she doesn't continue her work, but her receptiveness to other elements of activism continued to evolve in those last 3 years of her death. Initially, she didn't understand Coleman's draft resistance or the stance that he took, or the fact that he was willing to obstruct draft information to the extent of being put in prison. But she came to understand that and connect that to her civil rights activism in the same way that he connected his draft resistance to his mother's activism. And toward the end of her life, she participated in a gay rights parade, which Coleman, as he struggled with his own sexuality, it was something that was particularly important to him, that he highlighted, that there was something about his mother that allowed her to be still and listen and responsive and utterly humane and kind, and see a connection between her suffering and that of all kinds of groups of people.
This is kind of a question for everybody. And this question, with as much misinformation that is passed around, how do we bring these types of people back into the public without muddying? The phrase is muddying the waters is what this question has. So how do we bring those people back into light without bringing maybe false information or any of that sort of thing? What kind of take would you all have on that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, I guess I could start. I think we all have to be cautious of how we retrieve information and the validity of that information. That's just a fact of dealing with the electronic age that we are in. In terms of the women that the three of us are writing about, we continue to rely heavily on archival materials, and those are things that you can. It doesn't mean that there aren't errors. I mean, the medical records I looked at were riddled with errors, but you can understand the way that the past is being presented through archival materials and primary source documents. And you can see with something, and Cheryl talked about this, the letter that she came across that is in Ada's handwriting to Thurgood Marshall, right? That's not fake news. That's a wonderful find for a historian. And the Herland Sisters Resources is so rich with all kinds of information and literature. And so immersing ourselves in primary sources from the past are a great way actually to counter elements of false and misleading information that litter the internet.
And to add to that, as someone who directs the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, getting this collection from Herland was like, it was so exciting. One, because just the materials are so rare, but also because they focus on women. And I teach history of sex, and most of the documents about the history of sex focus on men. And even if you're talking about LGBTQ plus history, it's often white gay men. And so it was just so exciting to get lesbian erotica, lesbian fiction, historical monographs, things that you wouldn't even think of. So that's why I encourage everyone to come to UCO and visit our library at the center if you can, because we have books that you wouldn't see anywhere else, and they're very focused on this part of history there's so many levels to it. The level of, women's history, and then also LGBTQ plus history, and then women within that. We even have books about women in the HIV AIDS movement, which is also another thing in history that's been completely ignored and buried. So I think just the existence of our library is a move in the right direction. So it's a good question, because until then, most of our students, and even some of our older students who've lived in Oklahoma City their whole lives, they've never heard of Herland. So it's exciting to work on a project like this.
Cheryl, we've got some questions for you. They're kind of related, so I'll try to put them together a little bit. There's basically it's about Ada Lois's life after law school. Asking, did she practice, and more broadly, what jobs were available to women attorneys in the 40s and 50s, and then also, did she speak about professional interactions after she graduated with any of the people who tried to prevent her from attending the law school? So those are some of the questions that are coming in about her life after law school.
Yeah, and those are great questions. There's this iconic photograph of Ada Lois. There are actually two. One when she's being handed the bar exam, because like everyone, once you graduated from law school, you still had to take the bar exam. And this woman has such an ugly sneer on her face. Like, do I really have to hand this to you? And then you kind of juxtapose that to the day that Ada Lois signs the Book of Attorneys. And Oklahoma still uses this book, this big ledger book. And when you get sworn in, you have to sign in. And when I was at OU, I got admitted for special purposes. And I went up there, and then I saw the actual book where Ada Lois had signed in and took a picture of her actual signature on that. That's kind of the archivist kind of records and documents where you can really see, and I get excited about blue ink, I don't know why, but you see the blue ink signature because it's real. It's not photoshopped or anything, it's blue. So yes, she became licensed, and some of the cases that she took on involved and I apologize, I think it's Oklahoma College for Women down in Chickasha. She had to represent an African-American woman seeking admission to that. She took on a case involving the desegregation of a park in Oklahoma City. She took on a murder trial. So she had some business as a lawyer, but like so many African-American lawyers, but particularly as an African-American woman, it was not financially feasible. She did not have a broad enough client base to actually be sustainable and financially viable. But she would assist on the NAACP when they would have any of the cases in Oklahoma. She would serve as local counsel, but she ultimately ended up spending most of her professional career as a professor at Langston University. And this whole thing, did she ever talk to people who had kind of been in opposition to her enrollment? One of the I cannot believe, I can't believe I can't think of his name. Maurice Merrill was the attorney who represented Oklahoma in the Supreme Court and argued against her admission, was her con law professor. And she began to panic because she's, my God, you know, last time I saw this man, in essence, he was telling the United States Supreme Court, don't let her in. She's Black. We have to uphold the rules of Oklahoma. And she was counseled by some of her white male classmates to go talk to him, go talk to him. And one interesting component of it is a very supportive mentorship evolved between Professor Merrill and Ada Lois. And so it was, you know, it's kind of a double lesson, right? Lawyers argue the position that they're hired to argue. He was, you know, he was arguing on behalf of the state. He had to make that argument, but he did not believe it personally. And family members, there's some tortured correspondence from him where he doesn't want to do it. And so they were able to bond, even though he had so publicly taken that position. And she openly acknowledged the fact that he did not kind of live up to her expectation from that argument. The other piece about that brings it full circle, of course, is when Governor David Walters appointed her to the Board of Regents of OU. And so here she got to sit on the very board that so actively fought against her admission 50 some years earlier. So there's a lot of full circles and a lot of kind of connections with those people who had tried to preclude her admission that had to be really, really very symbolic for her individually. And I just got to, can I give a shout out to Bruce? Bruce, man, I love you. Thank you for all your help and support over the years.
We have another question for Dr. Churchill. So you mentioned that Barbara Walrue Cleveland was a leading figure in a predominantly white organization. Did she speak about her understanding of issues of race and class in the activist milieu of which she was an integral part?
Yes, and I think that's a really interesting question that some members of the group mentioned, and also Walrue herself talked about. So Herland was started by an African-American woman, but predominantly most of its members were white women of all classes, had working class white women and relatively upper middle class white women. And so when I asked her about this, she focused a lot more on her experiences in the music industry, actually. She was the first African-American woman to work in country music in Oklahoma. So she was producing country music. And so she talked quite a bit more about that when I would ask her about Herland than she did about some of the issues of race within Herland. And so I thought that was a very fascinating juxtaposition too, of her going from the activist world to then also working in country music. And for those of you, the reason why I'm in bed is that I'm in the 3rd trimester of my pregnancy and I'm very tired. So someone said that I need to be coached to not sit in the bed. That's why I actually am not, my feet really hurt. So I'm not trying to disrespect anybody by sitting in the bed. I just want y'all to know that. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I'm just propping my feet up.
We appreciate you being here. All right, and we have another question for Dr. Janda. Was there documentation of the treatment Rosie experienced in the asylum? And they have a further question. Was it personal for some who worked there who were against what she advocated for, if there is any documentation of that?
So Coleman was able to get her complete medical file, which is about 22 pages, single spaced. So there is information, a lot of it's contradictory. The most interesting, meaning that it'll say she's on medication, she is diagnosed as schizophrenic paranoid type. Some places it'll say she's given some medication for it, others it'll say she was not. She maintains she was on no regular course of medication. There are descriptions early in her file about some of the physical and mental exams that she's taken through She spent the first 6 months in the criminally insane ward of the facility behind jail cell bars, essentially. What's intriguing in the many entries by different people, so at least 4 or 5 different people, they would go back through her social history and the reason that she was in the facility. And they said these women said a range of things about why she was there, specifically saying that this was done to stop her from giving her house away to them, that she was giving her house to the NAACP so they could move into her neighborhood. Some places it mentioned James West by name, that she was going to give him her house, that confining her to the institution was the only way to stop this from happening. So it's abundantly clear in the discussions of the justification for why she's there that it was, first of all, to stop her from selling or giving her house away to this African-American man, or just more broadly to the NAACP, not that that was ever discussed. Again, there are a lot of inaccuracies there. But then the other thing that is clear is in the additional evidence provided to show that she was not mentally competent. There's information like she was too focused on trying to help people and gave money to handicapped people. She obviously is lacking insight because she doesn't recognize her own mental instability, right? And so it's this very circular reasoning. This person is obviously mentally ill because they don't admit that they are mentally ill. Those kinds of things are used. But I think the most damning thing that comes out of her medical file, aside from the lack of actual care that she got when she could have used it, is that she was there for the sole purpose of being confined to stop her civil rights activism. And when she does try to appeal to the governor, to write letters to legislators, she's told by the administration and the hospital that if she continues, she will not be allowed visitation. They briefly send her off to a smaller facility and only allow her back if she agrees to stop trying to secure her release. So it's abundantly clear she's confined for civil rights activism.
Wow. We have another question for Lindsay. Were there any negative ramifications from the community or other people regarding the bookstore?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Waru always jokingly says she wished they would have been protested more. So there was no like direct protest, but the biggest, I guess, point of fear for a lot of people was the newsletter. So Herland had a newsletter where they would talk about the new books they got, things that were going on in the LGBTQ plus community, and they would have to put it in a brown paper bag when they emailed, or oh my God, look, I'm so 21st century, when they mailed it throughout. They would mail, they actually had international feminist and lesbian groups on their mailing list, but they also had a lot of people who maybe couldn't make it to Oklahoma City to see the collection. So they would mail this newsletter out throughout the 80s, and they would have to hide the newsletter. And so one of the women that we interviewed said that her mail carrier had actually opened it and confronted her about, yes, having this newsletter and how frightening that was. So that gives us an idea too of what things were like in the 1980s in Oklahoma. I mean, to even receive this newsletter was so revolutionary that people were truly afraid of even getting this delivered. And also the house too was kind of nondescript. So when they got a house by like the late 80s, early 90s, I mean, no one really knew what was going on either in the house, the public. Good question.
Sarah, I think you said you had a question as well for one of the panelists.
Well, yeah, so I mean, I know we all kind of struggle with this sometimes, but I think especially like Ada Lois, when first time I read her autobiography, I was just engrossed, I guess. So my question is, did either of you find it hard to write about these women because it's so easy to look at them and be amazed by the things that they accomplished? Is it hard to be objective?
For me, it became a journey. So outside my office at OU Law School is the painting of Ada Lois with Thurgood Marshall. And I walk by that every day. and you could see how young she looked. And I would walk by it and say, could you have done that? If you'd had the chance when you were 21 years old, would you have said, let me be a plaintiff and let me do this lawsuit? And I had to search. I had to find out as much as I could about what she went through, what that experience was like, what the 3.5 years of life on hold was like. So I needed to understand it. I don't have an answer. I don't know if so it really became very, very personal for me. And when I found the transcript in the archives at the Oklahoma Library of that bogus trial about how Langston Law School, this school created in 7 days, was equal to OU Law School, and they measured the size of the desks and the number of books and all this other nonsense. I'm like, how do you not get so angry? How do you not get so fed up with the nonsense that you can let it go and go to law school? Anyway, so I loved it because it was a personal journey for me to kind of walk beside her and see what it was really like.
And it's definitely complicated, as Cheryl's saying, especially for us, because it's not even with Waru, it's with Herland altogether, because I've gotten close to quite a few women in the organization. And then, of course, they donated over 5,000 books to us, largest book donation, UCO history. They donated all these materials. And basically, because of that, I was able to say, hey, we need a space. Once again, it's about space for the Women's Research Center and BGLTQ plus Student Center. And it's largely because of what they donated. So it's very difficult. But we did include in our interviews questions about like transphobia, inclusion of trans women, what it means to be a woman, questions like that, because I think that's really important. But yeah, it is very complex, especially because they've donated and given so many great things to us. But we still ask those questions too.
Yeah. Well, I think we've gone through the questions that we have. Do you all have any parting information or parting words that you want to give to the group?
Well, we hope you will join us for the third panel. I think you're going to find that it is a nice completion, because now we're moving from the gendered politics of segregation to looking at contested notions of equality. And there we're really going to see some Indigenous insights from LaDonna Harris. We'll see Mary Fallon's use of motherhood in her political career. And we'll have an opportunity to look at the Equal Rights Amendment from the standpoint of a conservative minister's wife who becomes a champion of the Equal Rights Amendment in Oklahoma. So I think everyone should join us for that. It'll be a phenomenal panel discussion.
And if I can, I just want to take a moment to thank Sarah and Patty for their vision for this book and for the opportunity to contribute a chapter to it. I'm looking forward to reading it. I mean, I've learned about two women tonight that I didn't know anything about. And I think it all goes to show that, you know, we all hopefully make an impact in some way. We have different opportunities to do that. But I think as women, we have a special role, and hopefully it's a role that will be appreciated.
It's inspiring to be on this panel with both of you, so thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth, as well, and everybody, Kathy, for putting this all together. And if you are interested in seeing these rare materials, I put my email on the chat several times. You can find me pretty easily. But if you would like to come in and look at the materials, we would love to share them with you, because we want more and more people to know about this hidden history. And I think that's why this book is so important too. It shows people you think are, quote, just everyday people. They're doing some pretty amazing things out there. So thank you.
And the book will be coming out in fall of 2021. Is that the projected?
That is correct. It'll be out with the University of Oklahoma Press. It is now officially into manuscript editing. So things are progressing well. We're very excited about being able to bring all of these different women into a single volume, and you see them just across time, across political persuasion, across race, ethnicity, religious belief, all kinds of things, but you really see a commonality in women trying to create a space in which they are safe, they are welcome, and they can shape an environment around them in a positive way.
And like Sarah said, please join us on November 5th for the third in our series of 3 This Land is Herland programs. I can promise you that we will not have the same technical difficulties that we had tonight. We will guarantee that those do not happen. But if you do want to go back and rewatch any portions of this evening's program, we will have that available for you on YouTube. In the next few days, you'll be receiving an evaluation. If you want to talk about the technical difficulties, that's perfectly fine. I will expect it. But included with that email will be a link to the presentations on YouTube so that you can get that information and you can share it with other people if you like. So we appreciate you being here. We appreciate you spending your evening with us. Thank you to Sarah and Cheryl and Lindsay for giving us the information and for giving us an enriching evening. And everybody have a lovely night. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.